Today is our Thursday forms training for our summer series, and we are covering the DID form and the FVAC. And I think these will go pretty quick. So if you all have any questions afterwards on other forms, I'm sure we'll have time to cover those as well. And as always, if you have questions, we do have people joining us in the office today. Thank you for joining us live, as well as on Zoom. So if you have any questions as we go through it, don't hesitate to unmute yourself and ask or raise your little hand on the window. I'm not watching the chat box only because I'm working on one screen today and it's too much to have on my screen. So everybody hold on. We're logging in the car. So if you've never logged into your car forms library, before you go to our zip forms, you go to car.org, which is the California Association of Realtors, and then you click on transactions, and then it's going to prompt you to log in if you're not logged in, and then you're going to make like 20 more clicks, and then eventually you'll get to your car forms library. So continue to transactions is usually where it ends, and then it pops up a new window for you. So if you're having problems getting it to open and you haven't been in there before, it could be that your pop-up blocker is on, and that will prevent you from logging into the system. So just kind of keep that in mind.
So you want to go to Forms Library?
Yeah, you can go to your forms library. All right, while we're getting this opened up, does anybody have any questions? Well, we're just waiting for the spinning wheel of death to catch up.
What's the first form?
The first form is going to be the DID form, which is the increased deposit, the demand for increased deposit or something. I don't know what the first D stands for, but
So why would we receive a demand for increase?
yes. So if in your contract, we all put a good faith deposit on there, or your initial deposit amount, which is usually about 1%. It can be less or can be more, just so everybody knows. You can do anything with that initial deposit, but sometimes we do an increased deposit. And when you do that increased deposit, if your initial deposit wasn't 3%, you would want to include this DID form, which causes your increased deposit to fall underneath that liquidated damages clause.
Okay.
So make sure that that's part of the inclusion, because that liquidated damages goes up to 3% or the actual deposit, whichever is less. And so if we're doing an increased deposit, let's say that you said, well, after 10 days, we're going to start with 1%. And after 10 days, we're going to deposit another 1% of the contract price for a total of 2%. You would want to do the deposit and then do the DID form with that deposit to include it as part of that, that deposit amount. So DID. Your phone was angry. Oh, I'm still in the wrong library. We were playing around with the different libraries just last week. It's quite fun. If you didn't watch that training last week, it was select a library. It was quite fun. So I do recommend you go back and rewatch it, because we kind of dug into some of the random libraries that the Association of Realtors gives you access to on your car forms library. All right, it's the delivery of increased deposit and liquidated damages is what the DID form is. And the second one we're going to cover is the FVAC form, which is the FHA-VA amendatory clause. So now that I've got those both added to my transaction, we're going to scroll on down. We also talked a little bit about templates and updating your templates last week. So that's all on that training as well. There's some really neat letters in there for if you your buyer decides not to do inspections or is submitting a non-contingent offer with no contingencies on it, just notifying the buyer that they're going against our advice. So just some neat little letters that you can find in there. So we're going to open up the new form editor. And then we're almost there. Drag this one up here. All right, so delivery of increased deposits and liquidated damages addendum, as previously mentioned, because Adriana asked, we would use this on the residential purchase agreement. You have the option to have a deposit, and then you can do an increased deposit. There's lots of reasons you would do an increased deposit. It's usually to help strengthen your offer. Oftentimes it's like after removal of contingencies or after a certain period of time, you would do an increased deposit where your buyer would come in with more funds, and we want those funds to count towards the actual deposit. And so we would use this form here. So you would use this at the time the increased deposit form is paid, not with the offer or counter offer. Okay, so we only use it once that it's time for that deposit to be made. So your buyers technically, or a buyer, if you had a deposit, let's say the purchase price was 500,000, you had a 1% good faith deposit and then a 1% increased deposit after, let's say, 10 days. The buyer at the beginning could wire all $10,000 to the escrow company to hold those funds. With the initial contract, only $5,000 of that is actually their deposit. The additional $5,000 is just additional money the buyers wired towards their escrow, towards the close of escrow. So then at time of increased deposit, you could fill out this form and not actually have to send more funds over. And then you would include that additional $5,000 as part of the deposit. So keep in mind that the title and escrow only counts what's on that contract as the deposit, as the buyer's deposit. So your buyers could wire all of their down payment and closing costs with that initial deposit, and it would be totally fine to do so. The sellers only have access to that deposit if the buyers are in breach of contract, not the full amount that's in escrow. So just kind of keep that in mind. Or the second option is we wire the 5,000, or we use the electronic checks or whatever, and we deposit 5,000 on the date that the deposit's due. And then at the date the increased deposit is due, they would put more money into escrow. So there's lots of different ways to do that. But do know that, because this is always a question I get by my buyers is, well, what if I go ahead and wire additional funds over? Can I wire all the funds I need? Yes, you absolutely can. The seller has no access to those funds. The escrow company just holds it for the close of escrow. Okay. At the time the increased deposit happens, we want to use this form to incorporate those funds in as part of the deposit. So the following terms and conditions are hereby incorporated into the purchase agreement or other. So if it was a counter offer or something happened where the seller countered your buyers, you would want to check that box there and fill out seller counter offer or buyer counter offer. Maybe you got a multiple counter offer and the buyer said, hey, we'll do an increased deposit to help strengthen our offer. You could do a buyer counter offer. So whatever the last form in the contract is, you would reference it there. And then you're going to put the date. Oftentimes this date is going to be the date on the upper left-hand side of the first page of the residential purchase agreement, that one that's printed, not the date that it was signed. Or if it was a counter offer, the counter offers don't have those dates on them. It would be the date that the counter offer was signed by the initial party. So if it was a seller counter offer, then it would be the date that the seller signed it. That would be the date of the seller counter offer. No.
Disagreement was initiated.
Not if you're referencing the counter offer on here. So if we were referencing a counter offer, it would be the date that the first party signed the counter offer, would be the initial date of that. Okay. Again, yes, purchase agreement, it would be that date on the upper left-hand side of the first page of the residential purchase agreement, the printed date. Okay, your property address is going to go in here. It should automatically populate it because you should already be in contract. And then your buyer's names are going to go here. And sellers' names go on the next line. Please make sure to fill it out completely. It'll be really helpful for all parties involved in the transaction. Okay, by depositing on, and then this would be the date that the increased deposit is being made. Okay, so if it was due 10 days after escrow, then or if they delayed that for some reason and they were on day 11, you would put it in there. Okay, so this is the actual date of the increased deposit, and you're gonna fill out here the amount of that increased deposit. So in the example, we said it was a $5,000 initial deposit and a $5,000 increased deposit. So here's the increased deposit amount here of $5,000. So by depositing on 7/13/2023, the sum of $5,000 and then you're going to check how they are depositing this money. How was it sent over? Was it wired, personal check, cashier's check? It's probably never going to be cash because title and escrow don't take cash. You can do personal checks still for your deposit, not for your closing costs. Or if this is too close to closing, like your increased deposit comes in within a few days of closing, then it would need to be a different form than the personal check. But you can still deposit a personal check or wired funds. Most people wire the funds anymore. Keep in mind too, that if it's electronic check, so you're using the title company's electronics check system, that's still considered a personal check. It's not wired funds. So if we're not actually initiating a wire from the bank, we're putting in our routing number and account number into their system for the electronic check. That does count as a personal check. Okay, and this would be who is that deposit payable to? There might be an instance where the increased deposit goes directly to the seller. For the most case, that's not usually what happens. For the most part, it's going to go out to, like the title company. Title company is going to be who it was sent to or made out to, but you're going to put who you're sending that to. Buyer hereby increases the total deposit to, and then you have to do a little bit of math here, right? If we had 5,000 and 5,000, now our deposit is $10,000. So you need to add up those deposits on that line number 1. Any questions about the top or section number 1? Yeah. Yep. All right, fabulous. Moving on to section 2. If buyer and seller have agreed to the liquidated damages in the agreement, hold on, I got to figure out how to move you guys out of my window. There we go. The following liquidated damages provision is hereby incorporated in and made part of this addendum. So, right, so if we agreed to the liquidated damages clause in the residential purchase agreement, all parties have initialed it, then we're going to incorporate this in, or you could opt out of that and that liquidated damages clause by checking the box is not. Okay. Well, maybe they don't want the increased deposit part of the liquidated damages. Who knows? Or it could be, I don't know. For the most part, if you've agreed to it, it's going to be incorporated in as part of that. That's the whole idea behind behind the increased deposit is that you're putting more skin in the game, right? So this is incorporated in if we leave this box unchecked. If buyer fails to complete this purchase because of buyer's default, seller shall retain as liquidated damages the deposit actually paid. If the property is a dwelling of no more than 4 units, one of which the buyer intends to occupy, then the amount retained should be no more than 3% of the purchase price. Any excess shall be returned to the buyer. Release of funds will require mutual signed release instructions from both buyer and seller, judicial decision or arbitration award. You can, yeah. So if you have a listing or you have a buyer trying to be super competitive and they're like, well, I'm putting 5% down. Let's just put it all as the good faith deposit. It really doesn't matter because the seller can't keep more than 3% anyway. So it's just fluff. Yeah. It's fluff.
Yeah.
Don't get the wool pulled over your eyes. Fluff.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah. Yeah. The undersigned have read and acknowledged receipt. Now, keep in mind that you have to, for that to be the case, you have to agree to the liquidated damage clause, right? So if I was a listing agent and a buyer submitted an offer with a 5% deposit, and then I may not agree to the liquidated damage clause because that would allow me then to go after the buyer for potentially more in case of default. Now, the nice thing about the liquidated damages clause, right, is it pre-identifies the amount that the seller can keep in the event of a default so that we hopefully don't have to go to court action. It allows us to say, hey, you're in default. We already agreed that it would be the deposit or 3%, whichever is less. So since you're in default, I'm keeping your deposit. Like the buyer's already said that's okay. So it does set them up for success, where you're not taking it beyond just a cancellation of contract. All right, the undersigned have read and acknowledged receipt of a copy of this increased deposit liquidated damage addendum, seller signs, buyer signs. If somebody had received, if the broker had received the deposit, please don't take your people's money. Don't touch their money. I'll say it again, please don't touch their money.
Not anymore.
Never, don't ever touch their money. As
Used to.
soon, yeah, we used to. We used to hold their checks
I
for
know.
every offer that was made. We would keep a check written out to title company. Yeah, like months later, you'd be like, oh, whoops, I still got their check. Because what happened was they'd write us a check
Yeah.
so that we could send a copy of it with the offer, and then we would hold on to it. And then when they actually entered into escrow, they would write a new check made out to the actual title company so that that check could go to the title company. And then you'd realize, oh crap, I still got checks. Okay, but here's the deal. If we touch their money, we need to log it probably with Melina in the escrow, in the broker's trust account. So even if we don't deposit that money in our trust account, the fact that we're holding money, it needs to get logged in there that we were in receipt of that check or receipt of whatever it is.
Even if it's made out to the title.
Even if it's made out to the title company, because we're touching their money. Right. And then we need to let Melina or whoever know that then once we hand that off to the title company, that the check has been handed off, and you probably need to take a picture of it. This also happens because I used to pick up the buyer's closing packages all the time from the
Yeah.
title company and deliver it to them with keys. Well, oftentimes there's a check in that closing package because we always tell our buyers, don't send the exact dollar amount, or even if they do, there's usually a little bit of fluff in that closing statement. So they usually get something back at the close of escrow, and it usually is sent back to them in the form of a check.
Yeah.
So when you pick up that closing package, you now have the buyer's money in your hands, and that should be logged into the broker's trust
Okay.
account because you're in possession of it. Yes.
It's going from,
Even if you're going from the title company to the house.
Really?
Yep, you are in possession of that. To
Oh.
not log it is a violation.
Didn't know that.
I stopped picking up buyer's
Stop.
packages.
Oh,
You don't even have to stop at the office. You could probably just send her a copy picture. I've got there, here's the information. That would probably be okay. We can verify with Melina. I'm not sure if she's the actual person that would log that or not. She probably doesn't even know. Or Carly. Yeah, somebody here in the office needs to know that we were in receipt of that though. So see, it's so important that we cover this little teeny tiny form. Okay, so that is the delivery of increased deposit and liquidated damage addendum. Right, so there you go. It's a pretty simple form. It does need to be included though. If you can get away without using it, if you were a buyer's agent and you had an increased deposit and you didn't send this form over and nobody ever asked for it, then oh well. But on a listing, please don't ever let an increased deposit come in without using this form, because this is what's going to protect your seller to get that money if they were in breach.
Yeah.
Right. So we run our transactions differently for a buyer's agent versus a listing agent. Hence the reason it's so hard to run your transaction if you're dual agent on both parties, because the objective is completely separate on both sides.
So you don't.
You should, and they should ask for it.
I-
But if you could, just like you should remove your contingencies too, but if I can get to the end of an escrow without removing my contingencies,
Right.
that's a win, right?
Right.
So if I can put an increased deposit in escrow and not actually use this form to incorporate it in as part of the liquidated damage clause, then that's, error on the listing agent side for not requiring it. Okay. Any other questions on this first form, this delivery of increased deposit and liquidated damage addendum? All right, we're going to move right along to the FVAC form. Both of these forms are a little tricky today. They seem really simple and like, Amy, why are you covering these? But they do have some trickery involved in them. So the FHA VA amendatory clause is required for any offers that are made that are VA or FHA loans on those properties, or if our buyer switches from a conventional loan to an FHA loan, which they have every right to do. You would need to then come back and include this form. So it's an addendum to the purchase agreement. Generally speaking, it's addendum to the purchase agreement. But if you switched financing types partway through escrow, we may need to do like an AEA form just to identify that we're switching, and now we need this form signed. So it may be like an addendum to the AEA, the amendment to the existing agreement, or it could be addendum to a counter offer if it was identified in the counter offer that we are switching financing. AEA. Yeah, it doesn't always have to be included, so you could just do this as a purchase agreement, but the problem is if on the purchase agreement, you identified that it was conventional financing, we are now changing the terms of the financing, although it states in the purchase agreement that we can do that.
We can?
Yep.
I thought we couldn't.
We can, and the seller can't prevent us from switching financing types. As long as it doesn't cost them any money or delay the escrow or anything, delay any timelines.
What I'm seeing is FHA VA offer, especially VA offer, not getting accepted.
Yes,
So if I put
so if you're,
buyer's agent, if I put that they're using conventional financing and then they decide to switch to VA.
you
they
could
switch,
absolutely do that.
And the seller can't get out of contract.
The seller can't get out of contract as long as it doesn't cost the seller any money or delay the close of escrow.
How do you know it's going to delay? Oh, because of the date.
The date of the contracts, the date of acceptance. So, right, so if we switch from,
Do that.
if we switch from conventional to VA
Yeah,
and now we are
You're right.
needing repairs, then that's where your issue is going to come up, right? That the
Right.
buyer's then going to have to foot the cost of those repairs probably, or we can still
Right.
ask for them, but the seller
Right.
has no obligation to, and the buyer can't cancel based on not qualifying for the VA loan if on the contract we submitted conventional. So if they get
approved
Kibosh,
conventional
yeah.
rate.
not approved for the VA loan, we can't turn around and cancel because our contract says that we were doing conventional financing. So they would also have to be not approved for that conventional financing. So that loan contingency is based on whatever's on that RPA. Okay, so your loan contingency is based on the RPA. So if we switch financing or change things up, just be aware that it's based on that. And in order to change that, we would have to do an AEA form to change the actual financing for it to affect the loan contingency. So it does get tricky.
AEA would change.
Using an AEA and having all parties agree to it would change it. Yep. All right. You're going to put in the date here of whatever the document is that you're referencing. Again, most of the time it's going to be the purchase agreement. So it's going to be that date in the upper left-hand corner, the first page of the purchase agreement. I just repeat that over and over again because people always put the wrong date in this line. So we'll just keep repeating it until I die. It's all right. But between between buyers and sellers, so you're going to put their names on there. Buyer and seller are referred to as parties. Okay. Now keep in mind this form is required. It's a requirement for VA and FHA deals. Okay, there's no way around it. You have to include this. And if you're removing an appraisal contingency or you have like an appraisal gap on there, this form actually supersedes that. And so even if I have a VA buyer that comes in and removes the appraisal contingency, because we have this form signed in the deal, they actually still have an appraisal contingency.
They do?
They do.
So if the appraiser is late and then seller wants to remove the contingency on the appraisal, in essence, the buyer can.
So if the appraisal is late, the buyer can remove the contingency once we're in contract, right? But if I want to write an offer that's got no appraisal contingency on it, and I've got a VA buyer, they actually still have an appraisal contingency.
So if you're submitting an offer that's FHA or VA, you have to include.
This form is supposed to be included in all things because the lender needs a copy of it.
And it comes
Not
up
for
when you.
conventional.
No, it
No.
comes up when you click.
Yeah, when you click the box for FHA or VA, it automatically adds it to your transaction. Okay. All right, so number one is it is expressly agreed that notwithstanding any other provisions in this contract, the purchaser shall not be obligated to complete the purchase of the property described herein or incur any penalty by forfeiture of earnest money deposits or otherwise unless the purchaser has been given in accordance with the HUD, FHA, or VA requirements, a written statement by the Federal Housing Commissioner, Department of Veteran Affairs, or a direct endorsement from direct endorsement lender setting forth the appraised value of the property not less than blank. Now I've tried doing this at less than the contract price. It won't fly. The lender needs it at contract price. So, right. So we wrote an offer at 500,000. We're saying, hey, we're willing to put in a gap of 20,000. So we wrote, 480 in here and it still got kicked back and the lender's like, no, it's gotta be the purchase price.
Oh,
Yeah,
the lender will pick it back.
the lender will kick it back because they need a VA FHA addendum with the contract price on there. So, there's a couple workarounds for this, just so everybody knows. One of those is we could write like the gap in here, like, hey, we're offering 500,000 as long as it appraises for 480,000. But just know that after that appraisal is done, the lender is going to need one that states 500,000 and it's going to have to be signed.
Oh, because they don't want a loan on it.
They just need this as part of their file. It's a stupid requirement. If you've got a VA or an FHA buyer, they should be able to waive their appraisal. They should be able to pay a gap
Mhm.
and they should be able to waive their protection, but the whole way it's set up is that they're not. So we've submitted offers with that gap in there and stating that this, hey, we're okay with as good as 480, and then we just refill one out after the appraisal contingency has been removed again. So that the lender has the accurate one with the purchase price on it, not the gap price.
Where do you put the gap?
Well, that's why, so right here, so if I had offered 500,000 and I put 480, then I'm initially saying that, hey, we're good to go. So the seller has that, and then once the appraisal comes in, we all agree, we sign, and then we submit a new one, usually to the lender with the actual contract price on it. Okay, but anyways, do you want to put in that contract price here? Okay, the purchaser shall have the privilege and option of proceeding with consummation of the contract without regard to the amount of the appraised valuation, right? They can choose after the appraisal comes in to move forward. That's totally up to the buyer, but they always have that appraisal contingency built in with this form. The appraised valuation is arrived to determine the maximum mortgage the Department of Housing and Urban Development will insure, or the Department of Veteran Affairs will guarantee. Neither HUD nor VA warranty the value or condition of the property. The purchaser shall satisfy himself or herself that the price and the condition of the property are acceptable. If after signing this mandatory clause, the purchase price increases, buyer and seller agree to sign before close of escrow a new mandatory clause that reflects the final purchase price agreed to by the buyer and the seller. So see, it's saying that this has to have the purchase price on it. For FHA transactions, the mandatory clause is not required on HUD REO sales. So those would be bank-owned foreclosed properties. Okay, so if it's a FHA foreclosed property, had to have an FHA loan on it that was foreclosed, then this is not required. That's the only instance. Sales where the seller is a Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, or Department of Veteran Affairs, Rural Housing Service, or other federal, state, or local government agencies. Mortgagees disposing of REO assets. So anytime it's a bank-owned property, you don't need this form. Sellers at foreclosure sales, and those sales where the borrower will not be an owner occupant, right? So sales to nonprofit agencies. Okay, this is, it's all falls in there. So basically, if it's a bank-owned property, this form isn't required. Okay. And that's only for FHA, that's not VA. VA still requires it. Yeah. Certification. You may have questions about section number 1. Purchase price goes there. It outlines. Certification, the undersigned buyer, seller, and real estate agents or brokers hereby certify terms and conditions of the sales contract referenced above are true to the best of their knowledge and belief, and that any other agreement entered into by any parties in connection with the real estate transaction is part of or attached to the sales agreement. Warning is a crime to knowingly make false statements to the United States on this or any similar form. Penalties can include fine, imprisonment, or both. By signing below, the undersigned acknowledge that each has read, understands, and received a copy of this amendatory clause. So this gets included. You put the purchase price on there. It's a pretty simple form, but again, this just reinstates that the buyers, if they are using FHA or VA, do have the right to an appraisal contingency, even if they technically removed it with the offer. It just reinstates that. Another way that I've worked around it is I've put in the offer, like on the other terms, buyers waive their rights under the VA FHA mandatory clause under the FVAC form. And I've gotten that through some lenders. Some lenders come back and say they can't do that. We need you to fill out a counter offer or an AEA form or whatever it is, reinstating their rights under the FHA VA form. Yeah. it's, okay, so see at the bottom here, this is like, it is a crime to knowingly make false statements. The United States, this is like a form required by, because those are both government-backed loans.
Right.
So that's their rights under using those government-backed loans. Yeah. What you want, fill it out. But just know that, right? If you're a listing agent, somebody submits a non-appraisal offer to you and they're using FHA or VA, they technically still have their contingency in there. Yep. Even though they've removed it. Any questions on the FHA VA amendatory clause, the FVAC form? Any other questions on other forms or just random questions? We have a little bit of time. I was looking to see what was going to,
One form that was very confusing.
yeah, figure out. Next week, we're covering the AEA form and the AD form. So the amendment to the existing agreement and the addendum and how to use those appropriately. A regular addendum, because people use them wrong all the time.
Really?
Yes. Because up until like 3 years ago, nobody knew the AEA even existed. So everybody used everybody used an addendum for everything.
Addendum,
Yeah, addendum, right? That's all we did. And then we realized that there's an actual form to change any of the terms of the contract. So we'll go over that next week.
Look up the form that I.
Let's see. I'm sure Abby put in the, let's see, there's something in the chat box. Let me, oh, I thought it was Abby. Abby's got in the chat box the link to log your attendance. So if you're on Zoom, log your attendance. It also gives you a place on there when you log your attendance through Zoom where you can suggest additional training. So if there's something you want me to cover or something that you would like me to find a specialist to come in and teach on, let me know. We are having next week, maybe Abby will pop up the date and time for me on the chat box so I can see it. I think it's next week. It may be the week after though. We've got Scott coming back who taught the Chat GPT training. So he'll be back teaching on SEO and keywording and how to utilize that appropriately to help you come up better in searches and on Google and all of that. So he'll be back here towards the end of the month. And then next month, do I have a training set up yet for, this is July, for August? I don't, either in August or September. Either in August or September, we're going to have, I think Brandon's going to come in and teach on investing, setting yourself up to build your own investment portfolio. So how to get started with that. What makes, what to kind of look for in an investment property, looking in state versus out of state. It'll either be towards the end of August or towards the end of September. I've got to set that up still, but I talked with him this week. Next week, we have on, do we have one other training, Abby, on next week? Because let's see. We have your database, build it, work it, turn it into your gold mine. Oh, maybe that's the first one. Let's see. Luckily, she puts them on my calendar. Okay, so on Tuesday at 3, we're covering database. So we'll dig into your database again. We kind of talked about it a little bit yesterday. If you were on that training, it was fabulous. If you missed that one, we'll dive deeper into it on Tuesday at 3 o'clock. That'll be via Zoom. I'll be gone by then, so it'll only be on Zoom. But your database, build it, work it, turn it into your gold mine. And then we will also on Wednesday, we have prospecting with a purpose with Ashley Phelps from Placer Title Company. So that'll be a good one as well. And then your car forms training on Thursday will be the AEA and the AD. So Wednesday and Thursday are at 9 a.m. and Tuesdays at 3 p.m. Did you come up with that form yet?
No. No. Because I had trouble getting in. I don't know why.
We'll just hang out. Thank you, Amanda and Danielle, for hanging out with us today on Zoom. I know we had a couple other people left us. How rude. No, I'm joking.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Laptop on a bigger screen. If anybody wants to catch any of our previous trainings, keep in mind that I do have a YouTube channel where all these trainings get posted to. So we've covered lots of other forms this summer. We started at the beginning of summer covering all of the forms changes that happened in June. So you can go back and rewatch that to see what changed. And then, and Abby put that link in the chat box. If you're on Zoom, you can see the link up there. For the YouTube channel, as well as we have a tracker where we put links to all those classes. So we have a list of all the classes that are like part of the summer series, and then we put the links on there. So if you click on that link for the tracker and then save it as your favorite, then you can always just click on that and access that as well. And that takes you to those trainings on the YouTube channel. So. But anyways, we covered so we've covered a lot of good forms. We had a good conversation around the request for repairs and the seller's response to the buyer's request for repairs and how to fill that out appropriately. We've covered, like I said, all the forms changes that came out in the beginning of June, because CAR likes to update their forms in June and then right at Christmas. So just as you're trying to like finish out your year and wrap up putting those last things in contract, they always mess with all your forms. So you log in and you're trying to do something really quick so you can get back to your guests. And then you're like, it all looks different. What'd they do? Yeah, that's what they like to do. So we'll cover those again in December. We'll come back and revisit any changes coming up in December around that time period. Just trying to think what other forms we covered this summer. Oh, we covered the RLAS, the residential lease after sale, and the seller in possession after the close of escrow, the buyer interim occupancy agreement. And I think we covered that one, or it's on our list. We covered the contingency for the sale of the buyer's property and the seller's purchase of replacement property. So all those trainings are up on the YouTube channel or on that tracker that you can click on and go to.
It might have been all the county office things.
If you,
Oh.
if you're a buyer and you put a request for repairs, can the agent just give you like a verbal denial, or do they have to?
Yeah, so good questions. The question was, if the buyer submits a request for repairs, can the seller just give you a verbal answer, or do they have to reply in writing? The answer to that is the seller actually doesn't have to reply at all to a request for repairs. So they can give you a verbal answer. They can say, we choose not to reply. We're not going to reply. So when you ask the question, they can reply on paper. So it's totally up to the seller. There's no requirement for them to respond.
So if they don't reply, and when your buyer doesn't want to move forward, but they're not going to do that, so but just cancel.
Yep. Yeah. So if you submit a request for repairs, sellers don't respond, or sellers choose just to respond verbally that they're not going to accept those repairs. Keep in mind, if they're going to accept any of the repairs, it does need to be in writing. So we have it contractually in the contract that what they're going to do. But if they're not going to do any of the repairs, whether they don't respond, whether they respond verbally, or whether they respond on paper saying, no, we reject your request, this buyer then has the right to cancel the contract, assuming, and get their deposit back, assuming that the investigation contingency is still in place. Now, keep in mind, your buyer can always cancel the contract, right? So even if we removed our investigation contingency, they decide they don't want to move forward because they failed to ask for repairs, or whatever it is, but the buyer is going to lose their deposit if they've removed that contingency in writing. So remember, in California, to remove contingencies, it has to be in writing, or it's still in effect. It'll just continue to drag on, which is why oftentimes I don't remove my contingencies for my buyers until the close of escrow. I'll just let them drag on out there until I get pestered for it. But yeah, the buyer can cancel the contract and get their deposit back, assuming they have that investigation contingency in place and the seller doesn't respond to their repair request.
And if they don't respond, they're just, how long do you wait for we're gonna repair that one.
There's an expiration on the repair request. It's usually 3 days. So you'd probably want to wait till then, or I would ask the other agent, like, hey, you know, what's going on with the repair request? And they're like, the seller's choosing not to respond, and then be like, then my buyer's probably going to send you over a cancellation, like, right? So, and that could be a tactic as a listing agent. If you've got a buyer that maybe you've gotten a backup offer that's better than your original offer, the buyer asked for repairs, you can just be like, I'm not responding, in an effort to try to get them to cancel the contract if their contingency is not yet due. Once that contingency is due, or within 48 hours, you can submit that notice to the buyer form to actually remove that contingency so the seller can cancel. But since the seller can't just cancel the contract, that's one way to try to get the buyer to move on.
Yeah, someone can just.
No.
That, the form with the, seller payment to buyer's broker. It's still confusing.
Oh, yeah. So we did cover that one as well, but
I
let's,
know.
that's okay, but let's touch on it.
It's still confusing.
Yeah. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. Well, now
I
I'm
know,
gonna go back.
I've been on the training for it. So every time I just fill it out, and I do it wrong.
Yeah, so, so you're talking about the one where, is it, tell me do you have the form acronym?
SPBB.
Okay. So for the most part, we don't need the SPBB form.
We don't.
We don't need it.
Oh,
So as long as we're in agreement with, hey, the listing agent's asking or offering X percentage in the MLS,
so
and we're
as long
happy
as
with
it's in
that.
the MLS.
as long as it's in the MLS. And so there's a couple different options there, but let's pull up the form. I accidentally closed out of
I've
the,
seen it, nothing in the MLS.
well, it should
Blank.
be,
No, nothing.
it should at least say 0 on the cooperating agent commission is what you're gonna be.
Zero.
Yeah, it should say 0, but usually for the most part, it's in this area, at least, it's usually like 2.5%, right? Is what's being offered. So in order to use the SPBB form, there's lots of pieces to this. Number one, you have to have the BRBC form in the contract. So you have to have the buyer representation and broker compensation form in there.
I don't, that one's confusing to me.
Okay.
Buyer,
The BRBC, the buyer representation and broker compensation. That's what authorizes us to be able to negotiate with the seller to increase our commission. And that's what sets up what the buyer's commission is going to be, the minimum amount that we're willing to accept, and who takes care of the difference if there's a shortfall, right? So the BRBC form stipulates that, hey, I'm going to represent you in the purchase of a home anywhere in these areas. The minimum commission that I'm going to receive is going to be 2.5% or 3% or 2%, whatever you end up putting in there. And then it stipulates what happens, like, hey, I'm able to negotiate with the seller directly to increase my commission if it isn't to this amount. That's in there. It also stipulates what happens, like, let's say we put 2% and now we're being offered 2.5% from the listing agent as part of the MLS. It stipulates what happens to that extra 0.5%. Does it go to the agent, or does it go to the buyer, or does it get split between them if there's additional commission? The default is it rolls to the agent, right? So if we put 2% on there and then we get 2.5 or 3%, it comes to us. It doesn't go to the buyer as the default, but that is what authorizes us to negotiate with the seller directly to increase the commission. Okay, without that BRBC form, it even states it on the residential purchase agreement that without that BRBC, you can't check that box. So there's a box that gets checked.
okay. There's a box on the.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, there's a box on the RPA. So let's pull the residential purchase agreement into this, and I'll show you that box. And then all right, so let's go here to the purchase agreement. We're going to scroll down to the first page, to the grid. It's actually like on the third page of the grid. Just waiting for it to load. It'd be nice if my computer would think as fast as I did. All right, let's see here. We've got right here on line G3. So it's 3G3 of the contract. It's G3 of the grid. The seller agrees to pay the obligation of the buyer's compensation to buyer's broker under a separate agreement, car form SPBB attached. Seller's brokers offer, if any, to compensation, buyer's broker is unaffected otherwise.
Okay, so that does not need to be checked if we're just going along with what's in the MLS.
Yep.
So
As
that-
long as,
that was what was confusing.
as long as we're happy with what's in the MLS, that box doesn't need to be
Not
checked.
Okay.
Yeah.
But if there's like, I've seen a bonus in the MLS, then that would be.
Nope. Nope.
If it's
Because
in
the bonus comes from the seller's brokerage,
True.
not the seller. So then we would want to do a
But not that.
nope, it would be the confirmation of cooperating compensation. Yeah, the confirmation of commission. I can't think what that form is actually called right now, but yeah. Yep. So good question here. If you have a situation where there is a bonus offered in the MLS, number one, you've got it in the MLS that bonus is being offered, but we still always want to verify.
Yeah.
So you can do that form where it confirms the commission being offered.
Yeah.
Or if you're making an offer on a property that isn't one of our MLSs or a reciprocal MLSs, right? So if I was making an offer down on a property in San Diego, they have no obligation to pay me. We are not a cooperating broker to a San Diego MLS. Nope. So we would want to, with our offer, submit that cooperating broker compensation form to confirm the amount of commission that we're receiving as part of that. Now, most of the time, agents are more than happy to pay the commission, whatever was stated in the MLS, but keep in mind that if you are offering outside of our circle of MLSs, then you need to include that form in order to be compensated. So there's lots of, like up north, there's lots of little MLSs that we don't have access to, right? So if we don't have access to it, we're not cooperating. So you would need to submit that form.
What's the form number again?
That's a great question. I haven't come up with it yet. So hold on just a second and let me add it in here. It always takes me a minute to find it. Form library. Yeah. It's the cooperating broker compensation agreement. I think it's like a CBC. Let's see here. Hold on just a second. I think it's CBC, but I'll double check the acronym here in a minute. So it's a cooperating broker compensation agreement and escrow instructions. It's just yeah. Yeah. All right, so let's click on that. I'll tell you what the acronym is. It's CBC form. So cooperating broker compensation agreement. So that's where you would confirm that.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So if let's say the listing agent's offering you 1% commission in the MLS and you're like, that is not sufficient. I don't work for 1%. There's a couple different ways to handle that. Number one, you need to have that CBC form filled out, or not CBC form. You need to have the BRBC form filled out, which is the broker representation and buyer compensation, which states that I'm due this amount of commission for the transaction. Okay. BRBC. That's the buyer representation agreement. And then there's a couple different ways you can negotiate an increased commission. One of those is, instead of trying to negotiate with, hey, seller, you need to pay me more money, where the seller might receive you as being greedy, right?
Yeah.
You could always negotiate it as a closing cost credit to the buyer. So, right. So if I have the BRBC that says, hey, I'm due 2.5%, the listing agent's offering me 1%, and I want to negotiate a 1.5 or a 2% closing cost credit to my buyer, then I can submit to the escrow that, hey, I've got this BRBC that stipulates that I'm getting 2.5%. It says that, you know, the MLS is offering 1%, so there's a 1.5% gap. The buyer is going to pay that remaining 1.5%, and they're getting a 2% credit from the seller. So ultimately, the seller is paying an increased commission, but we're doing it through the buyer's method so that the seller doesn't perceive us as greedy. They perceive they're helping them.
Company, the title company, know that.
Oh, absolutely. And the lender also has to be aware of it, but you've got that BRBC form, which stipulates that the buyer agreed to pay you that. And so their credit is going to cover that. Now, I usually try to
That's if-
negotiate.
That's if the buyer doesn't meet all the credit.
That would be
You
where,
gotta talk to the buyer.
yeah, you've got to have the conversation with the buyer up front of, hey, here's what's happening. The seller's only offering 1%. You've agreed to pay me 2.5%. So that reduces your obligation to 1.5%. So I'm going to work to negotiate a 2% closing cost credit
Right.
to you as part of the escrow, of which 1.5% of that's going to go to take care of the obligation of the commission that's due to me, and 0.5% is going to go to your closing costs to help offset that cost, right? So I always try to negotiate a little bit more for them in that instance, so they're getting something out of it, but they've agreed to pay me, so
Right.
this takes that obligation off the table. Okay, if we were going to negotiate directly with the seller for that, so instead of negotiating as a closing cost, we can, hey, seller, stop being a tightwad and pay a normal commission, right? Whatever that might be. And whatever you've negotiated with your buyer. So the following terms and conditions are hereby incorporated and made part of the purchase agreement, right? And then you put the date, property known as, address, buyer, seller's name, and then we have the instructions, right? The buyer and seller agent have already entered into a buyer representation agreement. So you have to have that BRBC signed and dated before we write the offer. Before the offer. We have to enter into that prior to this date to make sure that it's safe and that you're good, right? Buyer has an obligation to pay buyer's broker compensation pursuant to the representation agreement after first deducting any amount that the buyer's broker will be receiving from the seller's broker through the MLS or other agreement, the CBC form. Okay. Buyer is asking seller to pay buyer's broker all or a portion of the balance due to buyer's broker under the representation agreement. This amount should be entered into in paragraph 3. Right? So this form is just stipulating like, hey, the buyer's asking you, seller, to stop being the jerk, to pay a normal commission, right? We're not asking for like 6%. We're just asking for 2 or 2.5, right? And hey, we're being offered 1 and we want you to cover the difference, right? And then we would fill out this form. So you'd put in here what's on the BRBC form. So maybe you put 2.5 on the BRBC form. There's no wrong or right answer to that. You could put 3% on there. I don't really care. It just should match whatever's on that form. Compensation from the seller's broker to buyer's broker. So what's being offered in the MLS, right? Pursuant to the MLS or blank, seller's broker has agreed to pay buyer's broker, whatever's in there. So let's say that it was 1%.
Oh.
So, right. So line 1 goes with what's in that BRBC. Line 2 is what's in the MLS. And then line 3 is seller payment to buyer's broker. This shall not be greater than the amount in paragraph 1 minus the amount in paragraph 2. So this is saying that, hey, we can't ask the seller for more than what the buyer's obligation is. So if the buyer's obligation is 2.5, we're getting 1%. That reduces it to 1.5%. Boom, of the purchase price or blank. So line 3 gets the difference of line 1 minus line 2.
That's where.
Yeah. Okay. And then the buyer signs this and you submit it with the offer. And, the seller might perceive you as a tightwad, or the listing agent could have been, unable to negotiate a better commission. And they may have told the seller like, hey, the agents that bring an offer, they're going to want like what's considered a common commission for this area or whatever. And you're not offering that, which may cause people to steer it away. So hopefully the sellers are aware that something like this might take place and that they've already been told that this is common. And now the agent can go back and see it. See, I told you, like, you should really agree to this. It's a solid offer and you should have paid a full. Yeah. Yeah.
On the low price on low end homes too.
Yeah. It's usually the low end homes because they don't gain value as much. There's not as much equity there. So, So yeah, so that would be how you use that form, the seller payment to buyer's broker. Again, we don't need it for every transaction. We just need it in the case that we've got the BRBC, the commission offered is being less, and we're trying to negotiate with the seller. We're going to check that box on the purchase agreement to utilize this form to negotiate up our commission. Okay, so that's the only time this would be used. Keep in mind too, that if you use the BRBC form, you also need to disclose to your buyers at time of offer what the commission is that you are receiving. And you can do that one of two ways. There's a form for that. It's called the ABCD form.
Oh, yeah.
Uh-huh. Or you can print up a copy of like the 1-page client report from the MLS at time of offer and have them initial it, because it discloses the commission now on those forms. So if you print up that 1 page, include it with the offer, they initial that they've read and acknowledged it, that discloses the commission. Or you can use that ABCD form, which the ABCD form is pretty simple to fill out as well.
Yeah.
ABCD, there we go. And
ABCD.
yeah, I feel like I'm making it up every time I say the name.
I know.
That's
And that
the,
is if you use the BRB.
yeah, if you use the BRBC, then you use the anticipated broker compensation disclosure for any offer. As long as you leave the defaults in the BRBC, the defaults of the BRBC is that you'll disclose the commission, right? Because we're asking them to pay commission.
Right.
And so we're telling them, hey, we'll disclose to you at the time of offer what the commission is going to be that we're receiving from the listing agent, so that you know ahead of time what your responsibility would, if there would be a difference. Okay. There's a box that you can check that would be when you're reviewing properties, but the default is by the time of offer. And this form here, super simple. You just fill out the top with the buyer's name, you fill out the buyer's broker, and then you put in the buyer's broker's firm there, the buyer's names go here, and then you're gonna just put in the property address, the date that you first showed it, the compensation being offered, and where that's coming from. Is it in the MLS? Is it the CBC? Is there a CBC form? Right, so wherever that is, buyer's just initial. And it's the setup with multiple properties, because you can use it at time of showing versus time of offer. So you can put multiple properties in here. Okay. Or at time of offer, you just do the one, yeah. And then at the end, you would just disclose the final compensation that you're getting paid from other parties. So you fill out this top section, buyer signs this box here in the middle, right? So you're gonna sign here, buyer's gonna sign the middle box, we fill out the bottom. That's all that happens on that form. This bottom section is to be completed upon close of escrow when the final compensation is determined. Then you put in the property address that they're actually purchasing. You would put what you're getting from the seller's broker, right? So what's being offered in the MLS. And then maybe if you negotiated more from the seller, so let's say in this case, this one was only offering 1%. So we would have like 123 Sample Street, Vacaville, California, 95688, right? And we showed it today, and they were offering, we disclosed that they're only, offering. So past that, there we go, 1%, and that's what's being offered in the MLS. And then we can have that conversation with them that we're going to negotiate with the seller to increase that commission and use that SPBB form, right? And then at the close of escrow, or pretty close to it, we'd come back and say, hey, from the seller's broker, we're getting 1%. Oh, we'd put the dollar amount there. So if our purchase price was 500,000, we'd say, hey, we're getting 5,000 there. And then from the seller, we're getting an additional 7,500 for an additional 1.5%. And then you put the buyer's broker's firm there, and then you would have your buyer initial at the bottom. Right? Or you could say that, hey, from the buyer, we're getting that additional 1%. Right? So whoever's paying that difference, if there is one. Now, keep in mind, if we fill out the BRBC and we put 2.5% or 3% or 7% on there, whatever you put, if you end up getting less in the MLS and you just want to adjust it so the buyer doesn't have to pay, or maybe like this, the buyer would be responsible for 1.5% to make it to 2.5%, which is what we put on the BRBC. And you want to adjust that down to 2%, we would use the modification of, or not modification terms, you'd use the, modification of terms form, the MOT, like what you'd use for a listing agreement to adjust the price, the commission due to you on the BRBC form. So anytime it's between you and a client, not the buyer and seller, it would be on that modification of terms form.
When it's between you and the buyer.
Yeah, you and the buyer, or you and the seller. Yeah. You and your client. So to modify the BRBC, it would be done on a modification of terms form. I feel like this is not charging my computer. It brings me sadness and unjoy. Sorry. Or it is very slowly. Any other questions? helpful, good information? Now you're all really confused. You're like, Amy, you
Lot
just
form.
spit out 6 other forms.
And say that again.
You're like, what? No, you can say that again.
I said you can say that again. I'm very confused.
Yeah, you're like, Amy, very confused, right? So